Hello, Dr. Chandler. Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this presentation on the book Financial Intelligence by Karen Berman and Joe Knight. Found the book so far. I've gone through the first six chapters and found the book to be incredibly engaging, surprisingly so, being that it's a book about finance. But found it to be engaging and insightful, and it certainly has captured my attention. And I understand the focus is more so not to talk about the ones and zeros as much as for managers to gain the concept of how numbers apply to the role that they play within an organization and how they themselves can be fiscally responsible to help impact the bottom line. So the book primarily focuses, at least within the first six chapters, of understanding the foundation, basic measurements, speaking about the income statement, the balance sheet, cash flow, and really understanding the difference between profit and cash. And what I also found insightful is an assumption that many of us have made, that finance and accounting is a science, whereas marketing and other areas within any organization are more art. I found that nothing could be further from the truth. There's a lot of art, using that term broadly, that can be found in finance. So the book talked about getting three primary areas of understanding. One, the understanding of the art and how it's applied, and providing you with the skills and the ability to question and challenge, so asking intelligent questions so that you're making calculated decisions. Understanding analysis. So again, if you can analyze the numbers that you're provided, by which you're minimizing your risk and making more calculated decisions within your organization. And then thirdly, understanding the big picture. So how the financial numbers and accounting assist us from a big picture perspective. And that's not just within our firm, but also from an economic perspective. How does that impact our big picture? From a regulatory perspective, how does that impact our big picture? From a competitive standpoint, what are we doing to offset or give us a better advantage, if you will, than our competitors? Understanding our customer needs was also talked about, ensuring that the decisions that we're making are in alignment with what our consumers are asking us for. And then in understanding the big picture, looking at technology and how a better utilization of the technological advances support us from a big picture lens. And the book, it spoke about finance as a language, and a language that can sound very foreign to those who aren't well versed in finance, but that you don't need to go deep to have have clarity of understanding of what the numbers mean. And it talked about that foreign language really being the foundation of a language of business, right? So business, you can only go so far within any corporate setting if you don't understand how you play a role to impact the numbers, and therefore how your department plays a role in impacting the numbers. And it talked about the what, why, and how questions, right? So deepening the lens of our ability to ask intelligent questions around an income statement as opposed to a balance sheet. And to see the relationship between the financials and the role that you play. So it talked about the three primary financial statements: the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flows, which we'll go into that a little deeper. And it talked about accounting principles such as GAAP and non-GAAP, which we'll go deeper in later chapters. And then it also spoke about understanding contribution margins, impact of exchange rates, and economic value add. And overall, how a manager then takes that information, a good manager takes that information and assists its team in understanding how their roles impact those important financial statements. So in chapter 2, it talked about fattening the bottom line, and that finance, again, is not always black and white, that there is art to it. And it's been widely thought that accounting and finance is much more a science than an art. But as you dig deeper, you begin to understand where there may be untruths. And I'm trying to read my notes here. Where there may be opportunities for our financial leaders to measure a company's profits in some questionable ways. So when do you view revenue, or when do you show revenue? Is it at the time that the order is made, or is it at the time that the order is delivered? And whereas the delivery certainly is the safe question, that doesn't necessarily make it the right question. It depends on the circumstances, but it's certainly the safer approach. And how you can quantify it's difficult in finance because you have to quantify some things that are not necessarily quantifiable at a snapshot in time. So you have to give your best estimate or best guess. And this is where the term cooking the books really begins to surface and define itself. These are all what we find our accounting minds doing are constantly guessing each and every day with the subject matter expertise that they have and some of the principles that we leverage. They're guessing to determine what our company's current state is from a day-to-day perspective. And what we learn is, again, in that art as opposed to science, that there is bias that can be applied to those numbers, skewing them, one way or the other with those assumptions. So judgment calls are definitely leveraged to determine, when we apply those revenues and what rules we use to apply them, and when revenue should be recorded or not. And the book also talked about fraud, and gave examples of when fraud has been evident. From a standpoint of most fraud is identified during revenue recognition. So within a time frame of 2000 and 2006, 41% of fraud cases were associated with how revenue was being recognized. And then it went into capital expenditures as opposed to operating expense, and gave some stats around those fraud cases that were identified further between 2000 and 2006. 11% of those were associated with how a capital expense was applied as opposed to an operating expense. And of course, that affects profit and stock prices depending on how you do that. The numbers are also used to make some critical decisions. So depending on how that judgment call and that bias is leveraged, we could be utilizing numbers that are inaccurate. It went further to define financial intelligence as the understanding of where the numbers are hard and where the numbers are soft. And hard are supported and non-controversial. So it's not a place where candidly, that's the science side of things. And then where the numbers are soft, where it is highly dependent on judgment calls. So soft numbers versus hard numbers, and really providing a definition. It was pretty surprising to me how I've utilized that language myself without truly understanding the definition of what it meant. I looked at it from a standpoint of, certainly, cash in hand, but really when it talked about hard numbers versus the soft, I think all understand the hard side, but the soft side is where the art comes in, and I just was not as versed in that as I thought I was. And the income statement, revenue, expenses, and profits for a period of time, and again, obviously, the income statement being the P&L, and we also talked about it being the net profit or net income and earnings, and versus the capital expenditures, which appear on the balance sheet, not the income statement, and that for those capital expenditures, only the depreciation of those expenditures actually show up on the income statement. Whereas the operating expenses show up on the income statement, and they do reduce profit. So the depreciation of capital expenditures show up on the income statement, and operating expenses show up on the income statement. But capital expenditures show up on the balance sheet. So chapter 2, assumptions and biases, the art of science, the art of finance. We talked about the accruals as well as the allocations. We talked about methods that were leveraged, and there were 3 primary methods that were talked about. One was price to earnings, which is essentially, your stock market is your rationale. So you take, your closing price for the stock market time the number of shares, and that gives you your price to earnings. Discount cash flow method, right, which is, the interest or the discount rate. Yeah, discounted cash flow method. The right interest or discount rate. And then the asset evaluation method, which is a collection of guesses. So clearly of those 3, the more conservative is for corporations, but clearly if you have a privately held company, that becomes much more challenging, and you have to use some other methods in order to do so. And I thought it was interesting how with the .com, you couldn't necessarily leverage any of these methods. So what was leveraged at that point in time was some very bizarre and unique exceptions where you actually looked at the number of engineers, or butts and seats as I used to look at it, to determine the value of a company. So VCs would look at that and make their decisions based upon. Chapter 3, why increase financial intelligence. It really went deep into how you decipher financial statements, how you can identify financial bias, the different calculation ratios you could use, and how a manager kind of stands out from his peers by his knowledge of how revenue is impacted by how we allocate dollars within our income, our financial statements. And also it assists in determining profit from cash. Chapter 3 just really went deeper into, as a manager, I need to be able to increase my ability to evaluate the company. How profitable are our profits and services, and being able to derive that by looking at the numbers. And what is our ROI, and is it based off of solid data? So there's a number of questions that could be asked. I really enjoyed the question that was asked around, there was an evaluation of a company that was being acquired, and I think the term was how long and at what temperature, and the accounting leaders had to decipher what was being asked there. And basically what he was asking was, for how long did it take you to put these numbers together, and basically what bias. So the time frame is how long did you study and assess before putting the books together, and the temperature is how much bias or art, right, did you put into it. So the assumption in the numbers and taking numbers, that felt comfortable, and how did you go about doing so. So, and then we talked about, or the book spoke about different roadblocks as far as, some finance companies like to hoard the data and not share it. So it may be difficult to get the data. You definitely want to ask questions, but you have to understand the assumptions, so those could be roadblocks. You may have a leader who doesn't want you to be questioning the numbers, but the goal of you being under a leader like that is to get them comfortable with understanding that you understanding the numbers is only going to improve the quality of the services being provided, and your understanding and driving the department. And again, it went deeper into shenanigans that different large corporations have used in the past. WorldCom, MCI was an example where they got into a great deal of trouble. Tyco was one that was also leveraged to speak about that. So first 6 chapters, going deeper into knowledge of just what these numbers can mean, and why understanding these numbers help the firm, but ultimately help you as a leader in deriving the appropriate understanding of what impact your department is making.